Hello, my friend. Welcome to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here, the best fantasy football podcast in Franklin, Wisconsin. I got my sponsored, but not actually officially sponsored, but kind of officially sponsored. One of my favorite beers here lately, Cream City Bricks by Enlightened Brewing here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So if you ever get a chance to come up here, or if you already live here, highly, highly recommend it. Currently my favorite beer, and no, this is not a paid advertisement, just really love the beer. This is episode 9, and I'm doing this thing at 11:52 p.m. because I promised to get you this thing by Friday morning. So quick sip, and then we'll jump into it. All right. Ooh, yeah, that's good. Episode 9, y'all. Episodes 2 through 5, if you've been keeping up with the novel, episodes 2 through 5 were a fantasy football overview of the AFC East, right? We covered the Bills, Dolphins, Jets, and Patriots. Episodes 7 and 8, we headed over to the AFC West, where we've already covered the Chargers and Raiders, and here in episode 9, we are going to talk about none other than the Kansas City Chiefs. And I gotta tell you, folks, this was one of my favorite ones to write. I had a heck of a lot of fun digging into the Chiefs for a lot of obvious reasons, right? We know that there's been a lot of turnover in Kansas City, and that means there's a lot of fantasy football questions that we need to dive into. Before we do that, as always, I just want to remind you that if you are the type of person who prefers to consume your content via reading and through article, everything that I'm going to cover today, actually everything I'm going to cover today and more, is in the article on the website, the link to which is right in the description of this episode. Quick reminder, if you're on YouTube and prefer podcast, there's a link to the podcast. If you're the opposite, if you're listening to this on pod and you'd prefer to see it on YouTube, there's a link to it in the description. So however you prefer your content, be it watching, listening, reading, there's a link somewhere for you to get to where you actually want to be. Now, before we jump into the Kansas City Chiefs, I want to take a really quick second to remind you guys that the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football draft kits are live. They're ready for you to dominate your drafts, and until August 1st, they're just $10. I'm usually charging $25 for them, but until August 1st, I'm charging just $10, or you can get the BBFF Season Pass, which is going to be unlimited content for all of 22 for just $40, and it's something I usually charge $75 for. So jump on that before August begins. Now, I told you, Chiefs, Kansas City Chiefs, super fascinating. Obviously, they're one of the more fun teams to target in fantasy football, but this year, more than any year in the past, there's some questions to dive into, right? Obviously, there's some already sure things at quarterback with Patrick Mahomes. There's sure things at tight end with Travis Kelce, but the running back room, the wide receiver room, there's a lot of new faces. There's a lot of new question marks and things that really can kind of shake up the landscape in fantasy football in 2022. Now, as you know, before we get to where we're going, I always like to take a really quick look at where we've been and where we're coming from. So, we've had 4 complete full seasons of the Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes era. In that time, the Kansas City Chiefs have finished no worse than 6th in scoring or 6th in offensive yards. They've been especially dominant in the passing game, which is no surprise to anybody once you have Patrick Mahomes under center. But in those 4 years, they finished 2nd, 3rd, 15th, and 9th in passing attempts. And that went from 2021 down to 2018. So 2nd, 3rd, 15th, and 9th in passing attempts. They've finished 4th, 1st, 5th, and 3rd in passing yards. So top 5 every single season in yards. And they finished 6th, 3rd, 5th, and 1st in passing touchdowns. So top 6 in passing touchdowns every year. So we already know that. We know they're a dominant team through the air, but they're considerably less dominant on the ground in the last 4 years. They have finished 20th, 23rd, 27th, and 23rd in rushing attempts, 16th, 16th, 23rd, and 16th in rushing yards, and 14th, 22nd, 13th, and 7th in rushing touchdowns. Now, fantasy football does not have to be difficult, right? Anytime you have the Kansas City Chiefs, anytime you have Patrick Mahomes, you know it's going to be a pass-heavy offense that scores a lot of points. But as we mentioned, there's some very considerable lineup changes, and that leads to corresponding questions that need to be answered and need to be considered when forecasting 2022. Now, as for those unfamiliar faces, we know that Tyreek Hill is obviously out the door. Also, kind of in lesser-known news, because they weren't really huge players, but Demarcus Robinson and Byron Pringle are also out the door. So that's the Chiefs' top 3 wide receivers from last season out the door on new teams. It frees up to over 240 targets. Now, in order to try and replace that production, they brought in free agents JuJu Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and they used their second-round pick, one of their second-round picks, on Skye Moore. Somebody else to watch and just a name to keep an eye on is Justin Ross. Justin Ross he went undrafted. He's a rookie this year, but when he was at Clemson, he actually outplayed T. Higgins and Hunter Renfrow as a freshman. He was very much on the radar as a first-round draft pick in the NFL before a critical spinal injury really put his not just his season, but his whole playing career in jeopardy. But again, obviously a ton of talent. The guy was considered a first-round pick at one point. He's a name to watch on the Kansas City Chiefs roster, and just kind of somebody to keep in mind, even if he is a supreme long shot to actually do anything. On the ground, the Chiefs they let Darrell Williams walk in free agency. He headed over to the Arizona Cardinals, and they added Ronald Jones, the former second-round pick with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they brought back Jerick McKinnon on a 1-year deal. So again, there's a lot of question marks that we should dive into, but let's start with what we know and what we're comfortable with. Let's start with Patrick Mahomes, because obviously that's going to be the key that drives the entire engine. So in Mahomes' 4 full years as a starter, he's finished as a QB1, QB6, QB3, and QB6. In passing attempts, he's landed 2nd, 5th, 18th, and 7th. He's finished 6th, 2nd, 10th, and 2nd in passing yards, 3rd, 4th, 8th, and 1st in passing touchdowns, 7th, 10th, 13th, and 11th in quarterback rushing yards, and he's added exactly 2 touchdowns in each of the last 4 seasons. More specifically, when you're thinking about it from a numbers standpoint, he has, over those 4 seasons, he's averaging 4,609 passing yards, 37 passing touchdowns, 280 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. More specifically, in fantasy point conversation, he is averaging about 374 fantasy points, or about 22 points per game. That's not surprising to anybody. You know Patrick Mahomes is the GOAT. I shouldn't call him the GOAT. It's still Tom Brady. But you know he might be on his way there. And you know he's great. So that's not a surprise to anybody. Talking a little bit about the floor and ceiling, he's been a remarkably safe quarterback over the last 4 years. He's gotten you at least 20 or more fantasy points in 65.5% of his games. For comparison, none of Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, none of those guys have been able to hit 20 fantasy points more frequently. And we know Mahomes has an exciting ceiling. He's been able to hit 30 or more fantasy points in 19.7% of his games. Don't overthink it, right? Patrick Mahomes, he's a bona fide QB1, he's a top 5 option, and he will be for the next decade. As for 2022 fantasy drafts, he's currently being drafted as the QB2 around pick 33, which is the late 3rd round. That's very, very expensive when you consider the opportunity cost of, the running backs, the wide receivers more specifically that are available in that range. Drafted within 6 picks of Patrick Mahomes in either direction, either before or after him, you can get A.J. Brown, Cam Akers, Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, Kyle Pitts, Ezekiel Elliott, T. Higgins, David Montgomery, James Conner, Antonio Gibson, Justin Herbert, Josh Jacobs, and Deontay Johnson. Of that batch of players, I would rather have A.J. Brown, Mike Evans, Cam Akers, Keenan Allen, T. Higgins, Kyle Pitts, and even Deontay Johnson. So, being that late third-round pick, I can't blame anybody for taking Mahomes there, considering the upside he brings, but he's just a little bit too expensive for my taste in fantasy football drafts in 2022. In my fantasy football draft kits, again, just $10 until August 1st, I have Patrick Mahomes in Tier 1A, coupled with Josh Allen and Justin Herbert. If you have Patrick Mahomes in a dynasty league, nothing to see here. You're set for the next decade. He's going to be a top 5 option for the next decade, for the next 10 years. I'm telling you guys, Cream City Bricks, man. If you are in Wisconsin, you got to get one of these. I don't think they sell anywhere else, but best beer that I know of right now. All right, let's head to the backfield. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I'm going to be calling him CEH for the remainder of this podcast, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Very underwhelming in 2 professional seasons in the NFL. In 2020, he was the RB22 at 13.5 PPR points per game. Last year, he finished as the RB28 with 11.8 PPR points per game. He has finished 41st and 16th in running back touches, 42nd and 14th in running back scrimmage yards, and 29th and 36th in running back touchdowns. Over those 2 seasons, he's averaging just 177.5 touches, including 27.5 catches per season, for 873 yards and 5.5 touchdowns. He's only been able to hit 15 or more PPR points in just 34.8% of his games, which, I mean, when you think about the fact that the guy was being drafted in the first round of fantasy drafts as a rookie, you're going to need more, 15 or more points in more than 34.8% of his games. And perhaps more frustratingly than that, the guy has never, ever hit 25 PPR points in his career. A quarter of his games in his career have resulted in less than 10 PPR points, including 30% of which last year were less than 10 PPR points. And then you look at the backfield competition, right? The Chiefs clearly aren't sold on CEH as the guy. They brought in Ronald Jones. They brought back Jerick McKinnon, who balled out in the playoffs last year. It's just not the type of the committee and everything that it looks like. It's not the type of running back that you want to target in fantasy football unless he's a later pick than he currently is. Now, in fantasy football drafts here in 2022, CEH is currently the RB27 in fantasy drafts. He's usually selected around pick 70, which is in the 6th round. That cost itself, that price itself, is completely fine. There's just a lot of wide receivers and quarterbacks that I would much, much rather have in that range where CEH is usually being drafted. So within 6 spots of CEH, either before or after CEH, you can get Cortland Sutton, Dalton Schultz, Brandon Cooks, Darnell Mooney, Dak Prescott, Damian Harris, Allen Robinson, Jalen Hurts, Michael Thomas, Jerry Jeudy, Miles Sanders, Adam Thielen, and Russell Wilson. He, if you couldn't tell, CEH he's a rare running back mixed into basically a treasure trove of different wide receivers and some of the later quarterbacks that I'd much rather have on my roster ahead of CEH. There's just so many names in there that come before CEH in my mind. So, I'm fine with him at the price, but I have very little exposure to CEH just given the wide receivers that are available there. In my $10 draft kits, loving this like free advertising here, but in my $10 draft kits, I have CEH in tier 2C of my fantasy draft kits. He's paired with Kareem Hunt, Elijah Mitchell, AJ Dillon, Damian Harris, and Tony Pollard. Dynasty leagues, if you have CEH, he is an intriguing case. He's obviously going to need to do something significant here this year if Kansas City's going to pick up his 5th-year option. It's highly, highly unlikely that happens. But if you have him in Dynasty leagues, you can't really afford to sell him now because his value in Dynasty leagues is at an all-time low. He's probably a guy you just hang on to and hope for the best, hope he turns things around in KC or gets a fresh start somewhere else next year. As for his backfield competition, Ronald Jones, man, I can't help but laugh when I think about the Chiefs signing Ronald Jones because it's like, what do these guys have, like a penchant for They love them, some underwhelming high draft capital running backs. The likeliest scenario in the way that it shakes out in that backfield is that Ronald Jones serves as the obvious running down back, the obvious, early down back, right? He gets the early down carries. He's not much of a receiving threat, whereas CEH steps in, he becomes that receiving back for the Chiefs. They actually do complement each other there very well from a rushing and receiving standpoint. And it works out really well in the NFL in real football, but it's very frustrating and doesn't quite work in fantasy football, which is what we're here to talk about. It's tough to forecast from a fantasy football standpoint, but it is worth noting that Rojo is cheap. He's currently the RB 43 in fantasy drafts, drafted around pick 121, which is in the 11th round. He's usually going with guys like James Cook, Kadarius Toney, Russell Gage, Pat Freiermuth, Michael Gallup, Alexander Madison, Alan Lazard, Cole Kmet, Tua Tagovailoa, Justin Fields, Tyler Boyd, and Irv Smith. Now, as much as I'm out on CEH where he's being drafted, I am, Ronald Jones is actually one of my favorite picks in that batch of players. He's a great late round running back selection. It's concerning to me. It's always concerning to me that he's not a receiving threat. Usually I like my running backs to be able to catch passes, but for an 11th round pick and a guy that could theoretically be the starter in KC, you're not going to find a lot of starting running backs in the 11th round or possible starting running backs in the 11th round. So I like him there. In my $10 draft kits, I do have Ronald Jones in tier 3A. I have him with Cordarrelle Patterson, Tyler Allgeier. I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. Tyler Allgeier, Ramondre Stevenson, Raheem Mostert, Sony Michel, Mark Ingram, James Robinson, Damian Pierce, and Marlon Mack. In Dynasty Leagues, Ronald Jones' value, like CEH, it's at an all-time low. There's a very, outside chance that he's the guy, but it really can't hurt to float a really, really late round rookie pick to the current Ronald Jones manager in your Dynasty League and just see if you can buy him cheap. If not, you're probably not missing anything, but you could do a heck of a lot worse trying to get something for that, third, fourth round rookie pick. I want to talk really, really quickly about Jerick McKinnon. We won't spend a lot of time here because, frankly, the guy's not likely to be on the fantasy football radar this season, but just know in the playoffs last season, he was the Chiefs' RB1, and the kid balled out. In week 19 against the Steelers in that wild card round, he had 18 touches, 6 of which were catches. He had 142 yards and 1 touchdown. He scored 26.2 PPR points. And again, Clyde Edwards-Helaire has never hit 25 PPR points, and McKinnon did it in the wild card round in spot duty last year. And then in week 20 against the Bills, he had 15 touches, 5 of which were catches for 78 yards. And then against the Bengals in the championship game, he had 15 touches, 3 catches for 95 yards. So the guy hit at least 12 points in all 3 of his playoff games. Then, of course, that 26-point explosion in the wild card round. So just keep him in mind. Keep him on your watch list. He's not a realistic draft pick. He's not somebody that you use a draft pick on. Just keep an eye on him and know where he's at. In best ball drafts, Jerick McKinnon is completely free and absolutely worth a 20th or 18th round pick because, what if it turns out he is the guy? What if he does get playing time? All right, quick sip of my Cream City Bricks, and then we'll head over to the wide receiver room. Man, that is hitting it today. All right, let's talk wide receivers. We're talking Tyreek Hill. We're talking JuJu Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Skye Moore. Again, reminder, Tyreek Hill, DeMarcus Robinson, Byron Pringle, all gone. That's 243 targets that theoretically need to find a new home in 2022. There's 2 things we do know. 1, this is Travis Kelce's ball club. There's no debating that. There's no denying that. This is Travis Kelce's offense, and we're going to get to that in a minute. 2, there will not be a new Tyreek Hill. If there's anybody out there expecting there to be somebody who steps in and suddenly becomes Tyreek Hill, that is not what's going to happen. In the past, it's been Tyreek Hill and then a bunch of guys at wide receiver. This year, it's going to be a bunch of guys at wide receiver, but no Tyreek Hill. Okay? Other than that, this, extreme wide receiver room makeover that we saw from Kansas City, it's anybody's guess. So, let's make some guesses. Let's start with JuJu. JuJu Smith-Schuster is easily the most proven of the new wide receivers in Kansas City. He already has a wide receiver 8 season on his resume. He's in that season, he drew 166 targets that he turned into 111 catches, 1,426 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Now, this was back in 2018, but we know that the guy can produce if given the chance. He also had a wide receiver 16 campaign back in 2020. He's been relatively safe as a fantasy football option in his career. He scored 15 or more PPR points in 44.9% of his games. Now, I do say relatively safe because it is worth noting, I do need to at least let you know that he has scored under 10 PPR points in 36.7% of his games. But still, 15 or more in 44.9% of his games. He has a questionable ceiling at best. Now, during that insane season back in 2018, he was able to hit 30 PPR points 3 different times. But since then, since 2018, he hasn't even hit 25, not once. One other thing to note there is he is just 2 seasons removed from hitting 20 or more PPR points in 25% of his games. He did that in 2020, and that's plenty acceptable, especially for a guy being drafted where JuJu Smith-Schuster is being drafted. So, easily the most established. Again, there's not going to be another Tyreek Hill, but JuJu Smith-Schuster is my bet to be Kansas City's wide receiver 1 moving forward. He's currently the wide receiver 33 in fantasy football drafts. He's drafted around pick 81, which is in the 7th round. To me, that's a mighty fine price to pay for that kind of upside, and a guy that already has a 1,400-yard campaign under his belt. He's just 25 years old. There's a lot of upside that he carries into this offense, which is one of the best offenses in football, and the guy's being drafted as wide receiver 33. That's a value to me. Drafted within 6 picks of JuJu in either direction include Adam Thielen, Russell Wilson, Devin Singletary, Elijah Moore, Gabriel Davis, Kareem Hunt, Dallas Goedert, Tony Pollard, Hunter Renfrow, Matthew Stafford, Devontae Smith, Cordero Patterson, Tyler Lockett, Tom Brady, and Rashad Penny. Of that batch, of that group of guys, JuJu is easily one of my favorites to target in 2022 fantasy football. I have him right up there with Adam Thielen, Russell Wilson, and depending on if I need running backs, depending on how my draft's gone, maybe Kareem Hunt and Tony Pollard. But he's definitely somebody that I'm clicking the queue up button every time he's approaching in drafts. In my $10 draft kits, I have JuJu in tier 2C. I have him with Adam Thielen, Brandon Cooks, Rashad Bateman, and Gabriel Davis. Dynasty leagues, JuJu Smith-Schuster. Man, it is so easy to forget that this dude is just 25 years old, right? He's been in the league for like half a decade, but he's still just 25. Now, he's super fascinating from a dynasty standpoint, right? We already talked about the potential and the upside that he brings into the offense, but what about the fact that he is on a 1-year deal with Kansas City? Of course, he could just re-sign with Kansas City next year, but he could play for the Detroit Lions next year. He's super intriguing. I think he's a hold in dynasty leagues to see what happens. You could make the argument that he's somebody to consider selling or putting on the trade block to see what you can get if you think that he's not going to be the guy and you think it's going to be MVS or Skye Moore or Mecole Hardman or somebody like that. So other than that, I think he's a hold. He's still just 25. All right, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, MVS for short, for the remainder of this podcast. He signed a 3-year, $30 million contract just hours after the Tyreek Hill trade. There's 2 sides of the argument here, right? The skeptics would tell you, well, MVS didn't really do much in a similar situation, right? He had a similar opportunity in Green Bay opposite Davante Adams. He had a similar caliber quarterback in Aaron Rodgers, but he's landed under 10 PPR points in 72.4% of his 58 games. So if he couldn't do it in Green Bay with nobody besides Davante Adams, why in the world would he do it in Kansas City? Now, the other side of that coin, the one that would, the people who would debate that would say, Well, the Chiefs are going to use him a heck of a lot more or a heck of a lot differently than the Packers did. The Packers used him basically as just a deep threat. Now the Chiefs went and gave him a surprisingly hefty contract for a guy that's not super proven. And for what it's worth, there have been reports so far out of Kansas City Chiefs camp that I remember reading two things. One, MVS has had a strong rapport with Patrick Mahomes. And two, there's another reporter that said MVS has been the best wide receiver in camp. You want to take these things with a grain of salt. There is frequently conflicting reports on these things, but it's at least worth noting, especially given how unsettled and how little we know about how that wide receiver room is going to shake out. He's undoubtedly going to have big days in 2022. I don't think there's any debating that, and he's already done it in Green Bay. He's hit 20 or more PPR points in 10.3% of his games. He just randomly pops up for big days. The problem this year, as it has been in previous years, is that he's going to be maddeningly unpredictable. You just have no idea when those big days are going to come. I love him for that reason in best ball. I think he's a great best ball pick given the draft price, which we'll get to in a second here. And in redraft, you could certainly do worse for a late round flyer. He's just not a guy that I would have a lot of in a typical redraft league. In fantasy drafts, he's currently the 54th wide receiver off the board, drafted around pick 137, which is in the 12th round. Again, that price is nice in best ball leagues, and you could certainly do worse in redraft. Like, what if he is the guy? There's certainly upside there. If he is, I mean, we're wrong in fantasy football all the time. What if he is the guy in Kansas City? There's a lot of upside there in that 12th round. He's drafted with guys like Darrell Henderson, Kenny Galladay, Nyheim Hines, Kenneth Gainwell, Rachaad White, Jarvis Landry, Jacoby Myers, Rondale Moore, Trevor Lawrence, Christian Watson, Jamison Williams, J.D. McKissick, and Dameon Pierce. Again, in best ball drafts, MVS is one of my favorite picks in that batch because you don't have to predict when he is going to, make that when that explosion game is going to happen. If you're not familiar with best ball drafts, by the way, I did write a guide. I wrote a primer comparing best ball drafts to, I consider them the one night stand of fantasy football. So if you're not familiar, head over to basementbrewedff.com, click on content, and you'll find a guide right there that can introduce you to the concept. But in redraft leagues, I would much rather have Kenny Galladay, Kenny Gainwell, Jarvis Landry, Rondale Moore, and Dameon Pierce. In my $10 draft kits, I have MVS in tier 4B. I have him batched with Kenny Galladay, Kadarius Toney, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Corey Davis, and actually several more. There's about 6 other names in there. In Dynasty leagues, it's worth noting that MVS, he's going to be 28 this season already, but it's somewhat notable that he's going to be in Kansas City for at least 2 years, whereas JuJu's just on that 1-year deal that we talked about. I think he's somebody to hang on to, assuming, you're not really going to get much for MVS anyways, so you might as well just hang on and see if he can become the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City, or maybe he's worth, I think if I'm somebody who had MVS in a Dynasty league, I would probably put him on the trading block and see if there's anybody in my league that's particularly hyped about him being in Kansas City this year. See if you can get some sort of return. If you want to talk about it, feel free to shoot me a message. I'm happy to, offer any insight or advice that I have there if you do get any trade offers. All right, let's head over to Skye Moore. One of my favorite picks in the draft. I was banging the table for the my Green Bay Packers, to go get him. I was super sad when they didn't. And then the fantasy analyst hat came on, and I got insanely excited. Skye Moore, Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes. It's just, we're pairing a great talent with great draft capital, second-round pick, with great opportunity after Tyreek Hill left, with a Hall of Fame quarterback in Patrick Mahomes. You could even say the sky is the limit. Man, I'm killing the dad jokes on these podcasts in the last 2 days. All joking aside, don't take it from me. Take it from the king of statistical modeling himself, my friend, my mentor, JJ Zacharyson. You might know him as late round QB. He found Skye Moore in his prospect draft guide. He statistically aligns with the likes of Cooper Kupp, Tyler Boyd, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, Jordan Matthews, Sammy Watkins, Allen Robinson, Andy Isabella, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Cortland Sutton, and, Devontae Adams. Obviously, there's a couple names in there that are kind of, they make your teeth, they make you cringe a little bit, but if you listen to those names again, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Boyd, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, A-Rob, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Cortland Sutton, Devontae Adams, statistically speaking, Skye Moore is comparing with a lot of big names that you would like in fantasy football, and now you got him with Patrick Mahomes, with a ton of opportunity, with good draft capital in the second round. I am all in on Skye Moore in 2022. I'm all in on Skye Moore for the next decade. In fantasy drafts, Skye Moore is currently drafted as the wide receiver 60 around pick 147th, which is in the 13th round. Funny enough, 10 picks after MVS, and personally, I would take Skye Moore over MVS just 1-to-1. Drafted within 6 picks of Skye Moore on either side includes Jamison Williams, Christian Watson, J.D. McKissick, Dameon Pierce, DJ Chark, Albert O., Raheem Mostert, Noah Fant, Ryan Tannehill, and Jahan Dotson. Of that group, I am most frequently targeting Skye Moore, and depending on how my RB room and my tight end room is looking, I might be looking at Dameon Pierce and Albert O as well, but Skye Moore in the 13th round, that's an insane amount of upside. What if he can be the guy right from the onset? There's just too much upside there to ignore in the 13th round. In my $10 draft kits, I have Skye Moore in tier 4A, with a bunch of other exciting rookie wide receivers, Drake London, Treylon Burks, Christian Watson. I also have him in there with Jamison Crowder because I can't quite figure out where else to put Jamison Crowder. In dynasty leagues, I have Skye Moore as the 1.06 or 1.07 in rookie drafts. I keep flip-flopping him and Jamison Williams by seemingly the hour. And I have him at wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 6 in rookie drafts. Basically, it goes Breece Hall and then a bunch of wide receivers for me. Let's talk Mecole Hardman, and then we'll hop to Travis Kelce and wrap it up. Mecole Hardman, we need to talk about because he's still being drafted. He's played 3 years in the NFL. He's been completely underwhelming. He's never averaged better than 8.1 PPR points per game. His 3 finishes as a Chief have been wide receiver 74, wide receiver 81, and wide receiver 76. Now, on the one hand, you could argue that he has a great opportunity, one that he's never had before, with no Tyreek Hill in front of him. He's in a contract year, so he's, the theory and the narrative that he's extra incentivized to play well. But on the other hand, he's had plenty of opportunity for the last 3 years. It's just been Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. There's been plenty of opportunity for him to carve out a role opposite Tyreek Hill. And instead of doing that, he ceded playing time and lost playing time to Byron Pringle and Demarcus Robinson. So he's had his chance, but in those chances, he's done nothing. He's scored less than 10 PPR points in 62.5% of his games. Each of the last 2 years, he's scored under 10 PPR points in 68.8% of his games. I don't have much faith in Mecole Hardman as a fantasy football option, and it's fair to wonder if the Chiefs even have enough faith in Mecole Hardman after they brought in JuJu Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Skye Moore. I think it's time to move on from Mecole Hardman in fantasy football, and frankly, it seems like the Chiefs think that too. In fantasy drafts, Hardman is being drafted as the wide receiver 64 around pick 164, which is in the 14th round. Drafted within 6 spots of him is Gus Edwards, Justin Tucker, so we're talking kickers now, Jamal Williams, Robert Tonyan, Jameis Winston, Darrell Williams, Tyler Algier, Mac Jones, Evan Ingram, Jalen Tolbert, and then another kicker with Daniel Carlson. He's fine for that price. Like, we're wrong in fantasy football all the time. What if he is the guy? What if he turns out to be the guy in Kansas City this year? There's some upside there for basically free, but usually my attention is turned to all of those other guys I listed, except of course those kickers. In my draft kits, which again, $10 till August 1st. I have Mecole Hardman. I have him in tier 4C of those draft kits. I have him with guys like Marvin Jones, DJ Chark, Jamison Williams, Jahan Dotson, Joshua Palmer, Van Jefferson, and more. A lot of other guys in that tier. In Dynasty leagues, I mean, the guy is still just 24. He's playing for a new contract. His dynasty value has never been lower. I mean, if you've ever been a Mecole Hardman believer, then now is your time to try and float out a really late draft, rookie draft pick, 3rd or 4th round or something like that, and take a shot at him, take a swing at him. I'm personally not, but if you're a believer in any way, take a shot. All right, Travis Kelce, and let's wrap this thing up. Travis Kelce has played in 4 seasons with Patrick Mahomes. In those seasons, he has finished as the tight end 1, tight end 1, tight end 1, and tight end 2. I keep hearing this narrative, or I should say seeing this narrative on Twitter, that we need to worry about defenses keying in on him, and now there's going to be all this double coverage because Tyreek Hill is gone. Okay, I hear you, but hear me out here. There's 243 new targets up for grabs. Travis Kelce's target competition is a bunch of unfamiliar faces under those helmets for Patrick Mahomes. Who do you think Patrick Mahomes is going to look for in crunch time all game long? All of these guys are first-year receivers with Patrick Mahomes. Who do you think he's going to look for? Do you remember that year, 2020, when the Las Vegas Raiders had basically no wide receiver 1? They had nothing at wide receiver, and then Darren Waller went on to rack up 146 targets. Obviously, it's not that simple, but I think if anything, we're talking about Kelce being a target vacuum and a target hog here in 2022. And again, this is Travis Kelce that we're talking about. The guy has finished 1st or 2nd in targets, 1st or 2nd in catches, 1st or 2nd in yards, and 1st and 2nd in fantasy points in each of the last 4 years. Every single year, he's finished 1st or 2nd in those statistical categories among tight ends. He's getting you at least 10 or more PPR points in 87.1% of his games. He's getting you 20 or more PPR points in 38.7% of his games. For comparison, to put that into perspective for you, there's been one other tight end who's been able to hit 20 or more PPR points in 38.7% of their games in just one season, let alone over the last 4 in just one season. Zach Ertz was able to do it back in 2018. That's it. Nobody else has done it in a season. Kelce's done it over the last 4 seasons in a row. So let's not overthink this one, guys. Travis Kelce, tight end 1, undisputable. I shouldn't say that. I mean, you could say Mark Andrews. He beat him last year. But to me, if there's a year to be in on Travis Kelce, even if he's getting older, this is it. So he's the tight end 1 for me. He's the tight end 1 for everybody, it seems. He's being drafted that way. He's being drafted around pick 14 overall, which is the top of the 2nd round. I'm completely fine with him there. I've also balanced out that portfolio a little bit with DeAndre Swift, Stephon Diggs, some other guys that are around there. In those $10 draft kits I've told you about, I have Travis Kelce, of course, at the top of Tier 1A. He's my TE1. I have him paired with just Mark Andrews. Those guys are the elite of the elite in fantasy football, and if you can score one of those guys, then you have a weekly advantage at fantasy football's weakest positions. Now for the sad part about Travis Kelce. In dynasty leagues, the guy's going to be 33 years old in October, and it's sad to think about because we've watched the guy grow up. But if you find yourself in a position where you're not competing near the trade deadline and you have Travis Kelce, it's time to start thinking about selling and rebuilding and seeing what you can get in return. And of course, if you are competing, see if you can go get the guy. That's it. That's a wrap on the Chiefs. I talked too much. I didn't even get to drink my beer, but that's okay. It'll be a nice celebratory beer once we're done with this. But that's it on the Chiefs. As always, there is again, if you prefer reading, there is a link to a article that actually covers, there's more in that article than I even talked about here today. So the link is in the description of this YouTube or podcast, wherever you're listening in. And again, if you are on podcast and prefer YouTube, find that link, vice versa. My only ask for all of this free content, guys, is please, wherever you are, subscribe, rate, and leave a review for me. And more than that, please try and think of just one person. If there's one person out there that you think would be into this content, please share it with them, assuming they're not competing in your fantasy leagues. Please share it with them. I am trying to get to 1,000 subscribers before January 1st, so I need every shred of help that I can possibly get. So if you're into this content, please share it. Share it with the world, if you will. I'm forever thankful for that. So Other than that, come hang out with me on Twitter. That's where I do most of my fantasy football talk, most of my fantasy football hanging out. I'm at BBFF Mikey. Give me a follow. Let me know where you came from. Let me know you heard this podcast, heard the show. I'll give you a follow right back. More than happy to do it. And then, again, remember, I don't know if you heard by now, but the draft kits, the fantasy football draft kits, they're $10 for the rest of the month. Till August 1st, price is going to be going back up. Season pass is just $40. That's an even better value. Up next, we're going to cover the Denver Broncos to wrap up the AFC West. And until then, thank you so much for being here. You're making a guy's dreams come true, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. So seriously, know that you're helping a guy, change his life for the better and chase a passion and try and turn it into a career. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Cheers. This brew's for you.